chapter of this semester, the autonomic nervous system, including some visceral reflexes. So, the autonomic nervous system is a motor nervous system that controls things like glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Primary target organs for the autonomic nervous system include the viscera of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. There are some structures of the body wall, cutaneous blood vessels, sweat glands, erector pili muscles. It carries out its actions involuntarily, without conscious control, intent, or awareness. Its visceral effectors do not depend on the autonomic nervous system to function, but the autonomic nervous system does adjust their activity to the body needs. Visceral reflexes include unconscious, automatic, stereotyped responses to stimulation that involve visceral receptors and effectors controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So, as we've seen in other reflex arcs, here we have a receptor, which would be the nerve endings that detecting things like stretch, tissue damage, blood chemicals, other stimuli. An afferent neuron leading to the central nervous system. An integrating center, those are interneurons in the central nervous system. Efferent neurons carry motor signals away from the CNS, and the effectors that carry out the end response. So we have receptors, such as a baroreceptor in the aorta, sends its signal to the central nervous system, the heart center, cardiac center, which sends information down the vagus nerve to adjust the heart rate. The autonomic nervous system has two subsystems, two divisions we often refer to them as. The sympathetic division, which typically prepares the body for physical activity, exercise, trauma. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, airflow, blood glucose levels, reduces blood flow to the skin and the digestive tract. The parasympathetic division, on the other hand, calms many body functions, reducing energy expenditure and assisting in bodily maintenance. Think of it as the resting and digesting state. Autonomic tone is the normal background rate of activity that represents the balance of the two systems according to the body needs. The body doesn't simply alternate between two states, action versus rest. Parasympathetic tone keeps smooth muscles and tone in the intestines, keeps a resting heart rate between 70 and 80 beats per minute. Sympathetic tone keeps most blood vessels partially constricted and maintains our blood pressure. So neither division has universally excitatory nor inhibitory effects, but there are some general things about them. The autonomic nervous system components in the central and peripheral nervous system. There are control nuclei in the hypothalamus and other brainstem regions, motor neurons in the spinal cord and the peripheral ganglia, and nerve fibers that travel through the cranium and spinal nerves. A motor pathway versus a somatic pathway. In the somatic pathway, the motor neuron from the brainstem or spinal cord issues a myelinated axon that reaches all the way to the skeletal muscle. In the autonomic pathway, the signal has to travel across two neurons to get to the target organ and cross a synapse where these two neurons meet in an autonomic ganglia. The first neuron in the pathway, the cell body, is in the brainstem or spinal cord. Its axon, known as the preganglionic fiber, extends to the autonomic ganglion. At the ganglion, the first neuron is going to synapse with the second neuron, and the neurotransmitter used at this synapse is going to be acetylcholine. The second neuron in the pathway, the postganglionic fiber, extends to the target cell. Its neurotransmitter may be acetylcholine, but it may also be norepinephrine, depending on the type of neuron it is. So in the somatic motor innervation, we get a direct connection to the target organ, whereas in the sympathetic motor innervation, we get two neuron chain. The sympathetic division, its pathways arise from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, so you'll sometimes hear to it referred to as the thoracolumnar division. They have relatively short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers, which means their ganglion are closer to the central nervous system than the target organ. The cell bodies of preganglionic neurons in the lateral horns and nearby regions of the spinal cord gray matter. Their fibers exit the spinal cord by way of spinal nerves T1 through L2. They lead to nearby sympathetic chain of ganglia, the paravertebral ganglia, a series of longitudinal ganglia that are adjacent to both sides of the vertebral column from the cervical to the coccygeal level. The sympathetic nerves are distributed to every level of the body, as shown here. Better one here, I think. Each paravertebral ganglion is connected to a spinal nerve by two branches called the communicating rami. The preganglionic fibers are small myelinated fibers that travel from the spinal nerve to the ganglion by way of white communicating ramus, white because it's myelinated. The postganglionic fibers leave the ganglion by way of the gray communicating ramus. It's not myelinated, that's why it's gray, and other routes. The gray ramus returns to the spinal nerve. Postganglionic fibers extend the rest of the way to the target organ. The spinal nerve route, the postganglionic fibers exit the ganglion by way of the gray ramus, return to the spinal nerve, and travel the rest of the way to the target organ. This will be most sweat glands, erector muscles, blood vessels of the skin, and skeletal muscles. Second route is some postganglionic fibers lead by sympathetic nerves that extend to the heart, lungs, esophagus, and thoracic blood vessels. These nerves form the carotid plexus around each carotid artery of the neck. Their issue fibers from there go to the effectors in the head. These would be sweat, salivary, nasal glands, erector muscles, blood vessel dilators of the iris, and some fibers of the superior and middle cervical ganglia form the cardiac nerves to the heart. And the third is the splanchnic nerve route. And so some of the fibers that arise from T5 to T12 pass through the sympathetic ganglia and do not synapse. They continue on as splenic nerves, and they lead to a second set of ganglia, the collateral ganglia, and their synapses are found there. The collateral ganglia contribute to a network called the abdominal aortic plexus, which wrap around the abdominal aorta. Three major collateral ganglia in the plexus: the celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. They're located at points where arteries with the same names branch off the aorta. Their postganglionic fibers accompany the arteries to their branches of target organ. The solar plexus is a collective name for the celiac and superior mesenteric ganglia. Its nerves radiate from ganglia like the rays of the sun, hence the name. Neuronal divergence predominates in the sympathetic division, so most sympathetic preganglion neurons synapse with 10 to 20 postganglionic neurons. One preganglionic neuron can excite multiple postganglionic fibers, leading to different target organs, and this gives us a relatively widespread effect. The adrenal or suprarenal glands are a pair of glands located above the poles of the kidney. Each is two glands with different functions. We have the cortex, which is the outer layer secreting steroid hormones, and then inner region, the inner adrenal medulla, the inner core, is essentially a sympathetic ganglia. It consists of modified postganglionic neurons without dendrites or axons. They're stimulated by preganglionic sympathetic neurons, and they secrete a mixture of hormones into the blood, the catecholamines, 85% epinephrine, 15% norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. The The sympathoadrenal system is the collective name for the adrenal medulla and sympathetic nervous system function, closely related in development and function. The cortex we will look at when we look at the glands, when we looked at the endocrine system in the next semester. The parasympathetic division, pathways arise from the brain and sacral regions of the spinal cord, so it's also referred to as the craniosacral division, has a relatively long preganglionic and short postganglionic fibers, so here the ganglia are closer to the target organ in general. Cell bodies of preganglionic neuron in the midbrain, pons and medulla or sacrum, segments S2 through S4. The preganglionic fibers travel through the cranial or sacral nerves and end in terminal ganglia in or near the target organs. They synapse with postganglionic neurons in ganglia, and the postganglionic fibers cover the shorter distance to the target organ. Parasympathetic division is relatively selective in stimulation of the target organ, very little neural divergence. Parasympathetic fibers leave the brainstem in the following cranial nerves: C3, C7, C9, and C10, which are the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. Remaining parasympathetic fibers arise from S2 to S4, and these fibers travel in anterior rami of the spinal nerves, forming the splanchnic nerves and the inferior hypogastric plexus. And some fibers synapse at this plexus. Most pass through, traveling through the pelvic nerves to the terminal ganglia. Their target organs include the distal half of the colon, the rectum, the urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. The enteric plexus, or the enteric nervous system, is the nervous network of the digestive tract. It has about 500 million neurons found in the wall of the digestive tract. That's more neurons, 5 times more neurons than in the spinal cord. Unlike the rest of the autonomic nervous system, it does not arise from the brainstem or the spinal cord. However, like the rest of the autonomic nervous system, it innervates smooth muscle, glands. It has its own ganglia and reflex arcs, stimulates motility of the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and secretion of digestive enzymes and acid. Normal digestive function also requires regulation by the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Hirschsprung disease is a hereditary defect causing the absence of this enteric plexus, so we get no innervation in the sigmoid colon and rectum. It constricts permanently and will not allow the passage of feces. Feces become impacted above the constriction. A megacolon is a massive dilation of bowel accompanied by abdominal distension and chronic constipation. It may lead to colonic gangrene, perforation of the bowel, and infection of the peritoneum, usually evident in newborns who fail to have their first bowel movement. Divisions of the autonomic nervous system have opposite effects on a target organ, and there are a couple of reasons for this possibility. Sympathetic and parasympathetic secrete different neurotransmitters, and the receptors on the target cells vary. Target cells respond to the same neurotransmitter differently depending on the type of receptor they have for it. There are 2 different classes of receptors for acetylcholine and 2 classes of receptors for norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is secreted by all preganglionic neurons in both divisions and by the postganglionic sympathetic nervous division. So neurons that secrete acetylcholine are called cholinergic neurons, and receptors that bind acetylcholine are called cholinergic receptors. There are 2 categories of cholinergic receptors, the muscarinic receptors and the nicotinic receptors. Muscarinic are found on cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, gland cells with cholinergic innervation. They act through a second messenger system. There are receptor subsets, give us a contrasting effect in some organs. So acetylcholine excites intestinal smooth muscle, but it inhibits cardiac muscle. And the nicotinic receptors are found on postganglionic neuron cells and the autonomic ganglia on cells of adrenal medulla and the neuromuscular junction of the skeletal muscles. They bind acetylcholine and they are always excitatory. They are ligand-gated channels, as we discussed in skeletal muscle. Norepinephrine is secreted by almost all sympathetic postganglionic neurons. The nerve fibers secrete norepinephrine are called adrenergic fibers. Receptors for norepinephrine are called adrenergic receptors. There are alpha-adrenergic receptors, which are usually excitatory. They do have two different subclasses using second messengers, alpha-1 and alpha-2. The beta-adrenergic receptors are usually inhibitory, and there are also two different subclasses, beta-1 and beta-2, but they use a second messenger system that involves cyclic AMP. The alpha-adrenergic receptors, again, are usually excitatory, beta usually inhibitory. Autonomic effects on glandular secretions are often an indirect result of their effect on blood vessels. So increased blood flow increases secretion, decreased blood flow decreases secretion. Sympathetic effects tend to last longer than parasympathetic effects. Norepinephrine released by sympathetic fibers can be reabsorbed by the axon terminal, diffused to adjacent tissues, or pass into the bloodstream. Acetylcholine from parasympathetic fibers is broken down quickly at the synapse. Some autonomic nervous system fibers release other neurotransmitters in addition to acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Some of those could include enkephalin, cyclin P, neuropeptide Y, somatostatin, neurotensin, and nitric oxide. Most organs have dual innervation. They receive nerve fibers from both the parasympathetic and sympathetic division, and those can have antagonistic effects, opposite of each other, or cooperative effects. The two divisions can act on different effectors to produce a unified overall effect. Even when the divisions innervate a single organ, innervation is not always equal, or does not always exert an equal influence. Here we see an example in the eye. We do not need to have dual innervation. Many organs do not have dual innervation. Some effectors receive only sympathetic fibers. That would include the adrenal medulla, the erector muscles, sweat glands, many blood vessels. So regulation of blood pressure and routes of blood flow, our baseline sympathetic tone maintains a vasomotor tone, vessels in a continual state of partial contraction. If we increase the firing, we get vasoconstriction. If we decrease the firing, we get vasodilation. And that can be used to shift blood flow from one organ to another as needed. We've discussed this in stress responses, which the blood vessels of the muscle and heart dilate while the blood vessels of the skin constrict. Autonomic nervous system is regulated by several layers of the central nervous system, the cerebral cortex and limbic system. Emotions influence the autonomic nervous system because of the connections between the limbic system and the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus contains nuclei for what we would refer to as primitive functions: hunger, thirst, sex. The midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata have nuclei for cardiac, vasomotor control, salivation, swallowing, sweating, bladder control, pupillary changes. Spinal cords has reflexes for defecation and micturition. Neuropharmacology is the study of the effect of drugs on the nervous system. Sympathomimetics enhance sympathetic activity. Sympathetolytics suppress sympathetic activity. Cold medicines are sympathomimetics, while beta blockers are sympatholytics. Parasympathomimetics would enhance parasympathetic effects, while parasympatholytics would suppress them. Many drugs also act on neurotransmitters and or their receptors in the central nervous system. Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It keeps serotonin in the synapse longer. MAO inhibitors block an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, and that slows down the breakdown of monoamine neurotransmitters, again, typically in depression. And the chemical caffeine competes with adenosine for binding to its receptors. When adenosine is present, we are in sleep mode because it binds to its receptors. Caffeine, similar structure to the two rings up here, can get into that receptor and block the receptor, so giving us the feeling of awakenedness. All right, and that will conclude chapter 15. I will be posting the final exam, the 5th exam, later this week. You have until the deadline to finish it, and I would like to thank you all for a wonderful semester, and I hope it worked for you too.